Her hands, chapped from endless cycles of washing and drying, trembled as she picked up the worn leather wallet. For Amelia, a 25-year-old waitress, drowning in debt and a life of quiet desperation, it was just another item left behind in the whirlwind of a busy night. But when she opened it to find the owner's ID, a small, faded photograph fluttered out, landing face up on the polished floor. Her breath hitched. The world around her, the clatter of plates, the murmur of conversations, the clinking of wine glasses dissolved into a deafening silence. It was a picture of a smiling young woman, her face radiating a joy Amelia had only ever seen in dreams. It was her mother. And standing beside her, with his arm wrapped protectively around her, was the man who had just left this wallet behind the city's most enigmatic and powerful billionaire. The Gilded Spoon wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theater. Every night, a new cast of New York City's elite filed through its heavy oak doors, their lives a glittering spectacle of wealth and influence. They came for the Michelin stars, the hushed ambiance that hummed with importance, and the feeling of being insulated from the gritty reality of the city that lay just beyond the velvet ropes. For Amelia Vance, it was simply a job, a grueling, relentless job that paid just enough to cover the rent on her shoebox apartment in Queens and chip away at the mountain of student loan debt she'd inherited, alongside her fierce independence. Amelia moved through the opulent dining room like a ghost, a blur of crisp black and white against the rich tapestry of mahogany gold leaf and crimson upholstery. She was efficient, her smile practiced, and polite her presence unobtrusive. It was a skill honed over 7 years of serving people whose shoes cost more than her monthly income. She had learned to anticipate needs to refill a water glass before it was empty, to clear a plate with silent grace, and most importantly, to become invisible. Invisibility was a form of protection. If they didn't see her, they couldn't see the exhaustion etched beneath her eyes, or the faint tremor in her hands at the end of a 12-hour shift. Her life was a study in contrasts. By night, she navigated a world of vintage Bordeaux and Wagyu beef. By day, she returned to an apartment where the radiator clanked a mournful rhythm, and dinner was often instant noodles supplemented with a wilting scallion. She was utterly alone, an island in a city of millions. Her parents were ghosts figures she knew only through the sterile, impersonal language of a social services file. Deceased, it said. No details, no family, no history. She had been a ward of the state until she aged out of the system at 18, spat into the world with nothing but a small duffel bag and a fractured sense of self. Her only tangible link to her past, her only proof that she hadn't simply materialized out of thin air, was a photograph. It was her most sacred possession, kept in a small velvet-lined box on her nightstand. The picture was old, the edges softened with time, and it was torn neatly in half. It showed a young woman from the chest up her hair, a cascade of dark waves, her eyes sparkling with a light that Amelia desperately wished she had inherited. The woman was beautiful, and she was smiling a genuine, unburdened smile. It was her mother. Amelia knew it in her bones. Who had torn the photo, or what the other half depicted, was a mystery that haunted her waking and sleeping hours. It was a question with no one to ask a door, with no key. Among the parade of faceless patrons at the Gilded Spoon, one stood out, Mr. Alistair Covington. He was a titan of industry, a name that appeared in the pages of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal with intimidating regularity. He was in his late 50s with a mane of silver hair, a face that seemed carved from granite, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He always dined alone, always at table 14, in the quietest corner of the restaurant. He was a creature of habit, ordering the same meal every time: seared scallops to start the filet mignon medium rare as his main and a single glass of Macallan 25 to finish. He was unfailingly polite, his "thank you" a low resonant murmur, but he was also distant, encased in an aura of profound melancholy. He never made small talk. He never smiled. He simply ate, observed the room with his penetrating gaze, and paid his bill with a black, featureless credit card. Other waiters were intimidated by him, but Amelia felt a strange kinship with his solitude. It mirrored her own. She made it a point to be his server whenever he came in, ensuring his water was always chilled and his steak was cooked to perfection. It was a small, silent ritual of professional care, the only connection she allowed herself. She felt that in serving him perfectly, she was bringing a small piece of order to a chaotic world, even if it was just his. Tonight, the restaurant was buzzing with a frantic energy. A famous actress was celebrating her birthday at a large table, and the paparazzi were camped outside like wolves, their camera flashes periodically illuminating the dining room in stark, intrusive bursts. Amelia was run off her feet, her muscles aching her mind, a frantic checklist of orders and requests. Mr. Covington sat at his usual table, an island of calm in the swirling chaos. He seemed even more subdued than usual, his gaze lost in the depths of his whiskey glass. He finished his meal, settled the bill with a generous tip as always, and rose to leave. He gave Amelia a brief, almost imperceptible nod as he passed, his usual silent acknowledgement. She watched him go, his tall frame disappearing through the revolving doors, and felt a familiar, fleeting pang of something she couldn't name. It was a sense of a shared, unspoken loneliness that connected the billionaire in his bespoke suit to the waitress in her worn-out shoes. She turned back to her work, the moment dissolving, as another table beckoned. She had tables to clear, bills to run, and hours to go before she could retreat to the quiet solitude of her own life. The chaos finally began to ebb around midnight. The actress and her entourage had departed in a flurry of air kisses and flashing cameras, and the dining room was slowly emptying out. Amelia moved from table to table, her body on autopilot, clearing away the detritus of expensive meals, crumpled linen napkins, half-empty wine glasses, and the ghosts of conversations left lingering in the air. Her feet throbbed a dull, persistent ache that had become the soundtrack to her life. As she approached table 14, she noticed something dark lying on the plush crimson carpet, partially tucked beneath the leg of the table. It was a man's wallet. It was made of rich black alligator leather, impossibly sleek and clearly expensive. There was no ostentatious logo, only the subtle, burnished glint of a small silver monogram in the corner, AC. Her heart gave a little skip. Alistair Covington. Her first instinct was a jolt of professional responsibility. The Gilded Spoon prided itself on its discretion and service. A lost item, especially one belonging to a client like Mr. Covington, was a matter of utmost urgency. She quickly glanced around. The manager, a perpetually stressed man named Gerald, was busy schmoozing with the last remaining patrons. This was her responsibility. She bent down and picked it up. The leather was supple and warm feeling, substantial in her hand. It felt personal, private. A flicker of indecision crossed her mind. She should take it directly to Gerald's office and lock it in the safe. That was the protocol. But a wave of possessiveness of connection washed over her. He was her regular. She would see to it personally. She rationalized that she needed to confirm the owner's identity before logging it. With trembling fingers, she unsnapped the wallet. The interior was as immaculate as the exterior. A row of black credit cards, their platinum and onyx surfaces gleaming. A driver's license tucked neatly into a clear slot. The face staring back from the plastic was younger, his hair darker, but the intense, stormy eyes were unmistakably his. Alistair Covington. Address a penthouse on Park Avenue that was probably larger than her entire apartment building. Beneath the license, tucked into a hidden flap, was a folded sheaf of cash, hundreds crisp and new. She ignored them. Money was not what held her attention. It was something else, something small and stiff tucked behind the credit cards. A photograph. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, pierced through her exhaustion. It seemed so out of place in this wallet, this life of curated perfection. It was an old-fashioned square-format photo, its edges yellowed and soft. She carefully slid it out, and the world stopped. Time seemed to bend and warp around her. The distant clatter of the kitchen, the low hum of the air conditioning, the very beat of her own heart, it all ceased. She was standing in a vacuum, a pocket of silent, breathless shock. The photograph that lay in her palm was the other half of the picture she kept in the velvet box on her nightstand. There was no doubt. The rip was jagged and unique, a perfect negative image of the tear on her own photo. The background, a sun-drenched park with a distinctive wrought-iron bench, matched seamlessly. And there, standing next to her mother with his arm wrapped securely around her waist, was a young Alistair Covington. Her mother was looking at him, her face tilted up, her expression one of pure, unadulterated love. And he was looking at her with an intensity that stole the air from Amelia's lungs. They were a couple. They were in love. The torn edge of her half of the photo sliced right through his image, leaving only his hand on her mother's waist, a ghostly touch she had never been able to identify. Now she saw the whole picture. Amelia's legs gave way. She sank into the nearest chair, the wallet falling from her nerveless fingers onto the table. The photo, however, remained clutched in her hand, a fragile, impossible bridge across 25 years of silence. A flood of questions, violent and overwhelming, crashed down on her. Who was this man? He wasn't just a customer. He wasn't just a billionaire. He knew her mother. He loved her mother. A more terrifying, earth-shattering question followed, shaking the very foundations of her identity. Is he my father? The thought was both a prayer and a curse. All her life she had been a story without a beginning. She was Amelia Vance, a name assigned to her, a person of no origin. The idea of having a father, a real, living, breathing father, and one of this stature was so far beyond the realm of possibility, it felt like a hallucination. She stared at the photo, her vision blurring with tears. She looked from the smiling young man in the picture to the memory of the somber, solitary older man who had sat in this very chair less than an hour ago. The lonely billionaire. Was his solitude a product of this lost love? Was he mourning the woman in the picture, her mother? Her mind raced, connecting disparate threads. His consistent patronage of the restaurant where she worked. Was it a coincidence, or had he been watching her? The thought sent a chill down her spine, a mixture of fear and a wild, desperate hope. The melancholy in his eyes, was it grief? Did he look at her and see her mother's ghost? Amelia's world, once small and contained, had just been blown wide open. The invisible waitress was suddenly at the center of a story she couldn't comprehend. The wallet on the table was no longer just a lost item. It was a Pandora's box, and she had just lifted the lid. Inside, she knew, lay the truth of who she was, and she was terrified of what she might find. The journey home on the subway was a blur. Amelia sat huddled by the window, the city lights streaking past in a riot of color that she didn't see. Her universe had collapsed inward, reduced to the two small pieces of glossy paper that now rested side by side in her lap. The wallet was zipped securely in her bag, its weight a constant heavy reminder of the cataclysm that had just occurred. Mr. Covington's photograph and her own half were finally reunited. The fit was perfect, the torn edges locking together like long-lost puzzle pieces. Seeing the image whole was both profoundly satisfying and deeply unsettling. Her mother and Alistair Covington. Together. They looked so happy, so oblivious to the cruel tear that would one day separate them. 1,000 scenarios played out in Amelia's mind, each more dizzying than the last. Was he the father who had abandoned her? Or was he the grieving widower who had lost both wife and child in one fell swoop? Was his silence a mark of guilt or a testament to a pain too deep to share? Back in her tiny apartment, the familiar clanking radiator and thin walls offered no comfort. They felt like a cage, a stark reminder of the life she'd been living, a life that might have been a lie. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. She sat at her small kitchen table, the conjoined photograph laid out before her, under the dim light of a single bulb. She studied their faces, searching for answers in the faded pixels. She saw her mother's eyes, her mother's smile. Then she looked at the young Alistair. Did she have his jawline, the shape of his nose? She held a small hand mirror up to her face, comparing, contrasting, searching for a resemblance that would anchor her to this new, terrifying reality. A profound moral dilemma gnawed at her. The wallet was not hers. The photograph was not hers. The right thing to do, the Waitress Amelia thing to do, was to call the restaurant report the found item and let management handle it. But the orphan Amelia, the woman who had spent a lifetime staring at a ripped photograph and a blank past, couldn't do it. This was her one chance, her only lead. Confronting him was a terrifying prospect, but the thought of letting this opportunity slip through her fingers was unbearable. It would be a betrayal of the little girl who had spent countless nights wondering where she came from. She decided. She would return the wallet, but she would do it herself, and she would ask her question. She would show him the two halves of the photograph and demand the truth. The next day she went to work with a knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. She scanned every face that walked through the door, her heart leaping into her throat each time a tall, silver-haired man appeared. But Mr. Covington didn't come. He didn't come the next night or the night after that. A week crawled by. His usual reservation slot on Tuesday evening remained empty. The silence was a new form of torture. Had he realized he'd lost the wallet and cancelled his cards? Was he unconcerned with its loss? Or worse, did he know she had it? Did he suspect her intentions and was deliberately staying away? Her imagination ran wild. Perhaps he had private investigators watching her apartment right now. Paranoia began to creep in a cold companion to her anxiety. She needed to talk to someone. The only person in her life who came close to being a friend was Ben, one of the line cooks at the Gilded Spoon. Ben was a mountain of a man with a cynical worldview and a heart of gold. He was a lifer in the restaurant industry, his forearms a tapestry of burns and tattoos, his humor as sharp and dark as his coffee. After her shift one night, she found him out back, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette in the grimy alley. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he rumbled, exhaling a cloud of smoke that swirled in the dim light. Amelia hesitated, then the words came pouring out. She told him everything: the wallet, the photograph, the impossible connection to Mr. Covington. She pulled out the two pieces of the photo and showed him. Ben took a long drag from his cigarette, his brow furrowed as he examined the image. He was silent for a long time. "Amelia," he said, finally, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "You need to be careful. Seriously, What do you mean, I mean guys like that? Guys with that kind of money and power, they don't have simple lives. Their pasts aren't just sitting in a wallet waiting to be discovered. They're buried. Deep. And usually for a good reason. He handed the photo back to her. This could be anything. Maybe your mum worked for him. Maybe they had an affair. Maybe he's a collector of weird old photos. You don't know. But Ben, the way they're looking at each other. And he's been coming here for years. It can't be a coincidence. I'm not saying it is. Ben countered his voice, firm. I'm saying you're building a fairy tale in your head. You want him to be your long-lost father, who's going to swoop in and solve all your problems. Life isn't a movie. Men like Covington, they have secrets and they have lawyers. Lots of lawyers. You go to him making accusations, you could end up with a restraining order, or worse, out of a job. His pragmatic words were a splash of cold water. He was right. She was vulnerable. She had no power, no resources. Alistair Covington could crush her without a second thought if he chose to. Doubt began to poison the well of her hope. What if Ben was right? What if she was just a foolish waitress about to make the biggest mistake of her life? So what should I do? She whispered, her voice cracking. Ben sighed, stamping out his cigarette. I don't know, kid. But if you're going to do this, you go in with your eyes open. Don't go in expecting a hug and a trust fund. Go in expecting a fight, and for God's sake, don't do it here. Don't put your job on the line. His advice was sound, but it didn't quell the storm inside her. The hope, once ignited, was impossible to extinguish. It was a fierce, desperate flame. Every day that he didn't appear, the flame flickered, but it did not die. She was trapped in an agonizing limbo, holding the key to her past, but standing before a door that refused to appear. The weight of the secret of the wallet, hidden in her apartment, grew heavier each day, a constant pressing reminder of the life-altering confrontation that she both craved and dreaded. 2 weeks after she found the wallet, Alistair Covington finally returned. It was a Thursday night, quieter than usual. Amelia saw him the moment he stepped through the door, and her breath caught in her chest as if she'd been punched. He looked different. The usual mask of calm, detached authority was gone. His shoulders were slumped, his face was pale and drawn, and there were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there before. He looked haunted, broken. Gerald, the manager, rushed to greet him, but Covington waved him away, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Amelia. For a heart-stopping second, their eyes met. She saw a flicker of something in his expression, recognition, perhaps even relief, before he looked away and made his way to his usual table. Her hands trembled as she picked up a water carafe and a menu. This was it. The moment had arrived, unannounced and terrifying. Ben's warnings echoed in her head. Go in expecting a fight. She took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed the front of her apron, and walked towards table 14, her legs feeling like lead. Good evening, Mr. Covington, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He looked up, and the full force of his exhaustion hit her. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a fortnight. Good evening, Amelia, he replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He knew her name. He'd never used it before. She poured his water, her movements stiff and rehearsed. The silence stretched thick with unspoken words. The wallet felt like a burning weight in her apron pocket. She had to do it now before she lost her nerve. He ordered his usual, but his voice was distracted, his eyes unfocused. After she placed his order with the kitchen, she returned. He was staring out the window, but he wasn't seeing the glittering New York skyline. He was seeing something else, entirely. "Mr. Covington," she began, her heart hammering against her ribs. He turned his attention back to her, his expression weary. "Yes, you left something behind the last time you were here." She reached into her pocket and placed the alligator wallet on the table between them. A wave of palpable relief washed over his features, so profound it was startling. He reached for the wallet, his long fingers closing around it. "Thank you." He breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I thought it was gone for good." He opened it, his eyes immediately searching the interior. He wasn't looking for cash or cards. He was looking for the photograph. Amelia watched as a shadow of panic crossed his face when he didn't find it. "Is everything there?" she asked softly. His gaze snapped up to meet hers, sharp and searching. "There was a photograph," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. This was the moment of truth. She took another deep breath and reached into her other pocket. She laid her torn half of the photo on the table, first the image of her mother facing up. Then she placed his half beside it, completing the picture. "I believe this is what you're looking for," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "I have a question for you, Mr. Covington. Why do you have a picture of my mother in your wallet?" The effect on him was instantaneous and devastating. The color drained from his face, leaving it a mask of ghostly white. He stared at the completed photograph as if he had seen an apparition. The carefully constructed walls of his composure, the ones he wore like a bespoke suit of armor, crumbled into dust. He looked from the photograph to Amelia's face, his stormy eyes wide, with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a pain so raw and deep it was terrifying to witness. "My God," he whispered, the words barely audible. "It's you." The air in the restaurant seemed to crackle with tension. For a moment, Amelia thought he might collapse. He leaned forward, his hands braced on the table, his knuckles white. He was no longer a billionaire, a titan of industry. He was just a man stripped bare, staring at a ghost from his past and her living, breathing legacy. He looked up at her again, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. I can't talk about this here." He fumbled for his wallet, pulling out a card. "Please, meet me after your shift. There's a park, Sutton Place Park, at the end of 57th Street. It's quiet there. Please." His voice was no longer that of a powerful man giving an order. It was a desperate plea. The raw vulnerability in his eyes disarmed her completely. The fight she had prepared for, the accusations she had rehearsed, they all evaporated. This wasn't a man with dark secrets to protect. This was a man whose secrets were tearing him apart. Before she could answer, he offered her a check from his checkbook. It was made out to her name for an astronomical sum. "For your honesty, for your trouble, please take this." Amelia looked at the check, then back at his anguished face. The money was an insult to the moment, a clumsy attempt to put a price on the truth she so desperately needed. She pushed it back across the table. "I don't want your money, Mr. Covington," she said, her voice now firm and clear, ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I just want the truth." He stared at her, his expression shifting from shock to a profound, aching respect. He nodded slowly, pocketing the check. The truth he repeated, as if the word itself was a foreign concept he was relearning. "After your shift." He stood up abruptly, leaving his untouched meal on the table, and walked out of the restaurant without another word, leaving Amelia standing in the silent eye of the hurricane that had just become her life. The last 2 hours of Amelia's shift were an exercise in surrealism. She floated through her duties, her mind a million miles away. The clatter of the restaurant, the demands of her customers, it was all background noise, to the thunderous beating of her own heart. When she finally clocked out, she changed out of her uniform with shaking hands and walked out into the cool night air. Sutton Place Park was a small, quiet oasis perched above the East River. The lights of the Queensborough Bridge glittered on the dark water, and the gentle murmur of the city seemed a world away. Alistair Covington was waiting for her on a secluded bench, staring out at the river. He looked older and more fragile than he did in the harsh lighting of the restaurant. As she approached, he stood up. For a long moment, they just stood there, in silence, two strangers bound by a ghost and a photograph. "Thank you for coming," he said, finally, his voice hoarse. "You said you'd tell me the truth," Amelia replied, hugging her arms around herself, a futile defense against the emotional chill in the air. He gestured to the bench, and they sat down a careful distance between them. He took a deep, shuddering breath, as if steeling himself for an ordeal. The woman in the photograph, he began his gaze fixed on the dark water. Her name was Eleanor Vance. The name struck Amelia like a physical blow. Her name! He had given her mother's name, a small, vital piece of her identity, gifted to her in a quiet park by a broken billionaire. She was the love of my life, Alistair continued, his voice thick with a grief that 25 years had clearly not diminished. And you are her daughter. Amelia waited her entire being, coiled into a single agonizing question. She had to ask. She had to know. Are you? She started, unable to finish the sentence. Alistair turned to look at her then, and his eyes were filled with an unbearable sadness. No, Amelia, I am not your father. The words which she had both dreaded and prayed for landed with a hollow thud. The relief was instantly swamped by a fresh wave of confusion. If he wasn't her father, then who was he? And who was the man who had given her life? We were engaged, Alistair explained, his voice a low whisper. We were going to be married. I loved her more than life itself. And I loved you even before you were born. I was going to raise you as my own. He painted a picture for her, his words hesitant at first, then flowing with the torrent of long-suppressed memories. He told her about Eleanor, her fierce intelligence, her infectious laugh, the way she could light up a room with her smile. He spoke of how they met a chance encounter at a gallery, and how they fell in love quickly and completely. It was a beautiful, idyllic story, but a shadow lay beneath it. Eleanor had a past, Alistair said, his tone darkening, a past she was trying to escape. Before she met me, she was involved with another man, a very charming, very handsome, and very dangerous man. His name was Richard Sterling. The name meant nothing to Amelia, but the way Alistair said it sent a shiver of dread down her spine. Richard came from old money, a powerful family with a dark reputation. They saw themselves as being above the law. He was possessive, controlling, and had a violent temper. Eleanor was young, and she was swept away by him at first, but she quickly saw the darkness in him. When she tried to leave, he wouldn't let her go. He saw her as a possession. He paused, gathering himself. Then she found out she was pregnant. With you. That was the final straw. She knew she couldn't bring a child into that world, into his world. She was terrified of what he would do. So she ran. She disappeared, changed her name, and tried to build a new life. That's when I met her. She told me everything. It didn't matter to me. I loved her, and I loved the child she was carrying. I promised her I would protect you both. His voice broke on the last words, and he looked away, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Amelia sat frozen, a spectator to his decades-old grief. Her mother wasn't just a smiling woman in a photo. She was a woman on the run, a woman fighting for her child's life. And this man, Alistair, had been her protector. Richard Sterling. Alistair continued, his voice, now laced with a cold, hard fury, is your biological father, and he is the man who destroyed all of our lives. The revelation was a punch to the gut. Her father wasn't a hero, a mystery, or a tragic figure. He was a monster. The man whose blood ran in her veins was the reason her mother had to flee, the reason she was an orphan. The shame was immediate and suffocating, a hot, bitter poison in her throat. What happened to her? Amelia asked, her voice a thread. Alistair's face contorted in pain. He found us. I don't know how. I had used all my resources to hide us, but his family's reach was long. He found us just a few months after you were born. He hunted her down like an animal. He stared at Amelia, his eyes begging for her understanding, for her forgiveness. I was going to get you both out of the country. We had everything planned. Passports, a house, waiting for us in Spain. We were supposed to leave on a Tuesday night. But he found us first. The story hung in the air, incomplete and terrifying. Her father, a man she'd never met, had a name and a face in her mind, now a dark, villainous one. And Alistair Covington wasn't her father, but something more complex, her mother's great love, her would-be savior, the keeper of a story that was rightfully hers. The tears that had been threatening finally came silent. Tears for the mother she had never known, for the life she had never had, and for the kind, heartbroken man sitting beside her, who had lost everything. The cool night air of the park felt heavy, charged with the ghosts of the past. Alistair didn't rush his story. He let the words hang between them, each one a stone laid on the path to a devastating truth. Amelia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, feeling a strange duality, the profound grief of an orphan learning her history, and the detached shock of hearing a story so tragic it felt like fiction. The night we were supposed to leave, Alistair resumed his voice, barely more than a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile memory Richard showed up at the small apartment where we were hiding. He wasn't alone. He had two men with him, the kind of men who look through you, whose profession is intimidation. Amelia could picture it, the scene playing out in her mind's eye with terrifying clarity, the cramped apartment, the packed bags by the door, the sudden violent intrusion. There was a confrontation, Alistair said, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. I tried to stop him. I told him to take whatever he wanted, to leave Eleanor and the baby alone. But he wasn't there for money. He was there for her. He had this insane look in his eye, a look of pure, obsessive rage. He said if he couldn't have her, no one could. Amelia flinched. The casual cruelty of the phrase was chilling. It all happened so fast. Alistair continued, his voice strained. He grabbed Eleanor. I fought back, but his men, they were professionals. They held me back. I had to watch helpless as he dragged her towards the door. Alistair choked on a sob, the memory as raw and agonizing as if it had happened yesterday. But Eleanor, she was a fighter. She was brilliant. In the midst of all that chaos, her only thought was of you. You were in your bassinet, sleeping. While I was struggling with one of the men, she did something I'll never forget. She broke free from Richard for just a second. She didn't run to me. She ran to you. Amelia held her breath, her heart pounding. She scooped you up, wrapped you in your blanket, and looked at me. Her eyes, my God, her eyes. They weren't panicked. They were clear, determined. She screamed at me, "The fire escape, Alistair. The fire escape." Richard was coming for her again, and she did the one thing he would never expect. He looked directly at Amelia, his own eyes mirroring the awe and agony of that moment. She ran to the back of the apartment, not to the fire escape, but to the front door of the neighboring apartment. The door was unlocked. Our neighbor was a sweet, elderly woman, a nun who volunteered at a local church, Sister Catherine. Eleanor shoved you, the baby, into the woman's arms. I saw her press something into the blanket with you. It was her half of the photograph. She screamed, "Keep her safe. Please, for the love of God, keep her safe." Then she slammed the door shut. The pieces clicked into place with dizzying speed. The orphanage, St. Jude's Home for Children, run by nuns. Amelia had been found on their doorstep, a newborn with no name, wrapped in a blanket with a torn photograph as her only birthright. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She had saved her. It was a diversion, Alistair said, his voice filled with a painful reverence. She bought you time. She led Richard and his men away from you. She knew he would follow her, that his obsession was with her. She sacrificed herself to give you a chance to escape. I saw her look back one last time as he dragged her out to the street and forced her into a black car. That was the last time I ever saw her. The truth was so much more heroic and so much more heartbreaking than anything Amelia could have imagined. Her mother was not a victim who had been taken. She was a warrior who had made an impossible choice. The tears streaming down Amelia's face now were not just tears of sorrow, but of a fierce, aching pride. "What did you do?" Amelia whispered. "His men worked me over pretty badly. By the time I came to and got free, they were long gone. The first thing I did was go to Sister Catherine's. She was terrified. She had called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of a struggle, no evidence. The neighbors heard nothing. To the world, it was as if Eleanor Vance had simply vanished into thin air. Sister Catherine, honoring Eleanor's desperate plea, told the authorities she had found a baby abandoned on the church steps. She protected you just as your mother asked. And Richard Sterling. A cold, hard venom entered Alistair's voice. I went to the police. I used every ounce of my influence. But the Sterling family closed ranks. Their lawyers created a story that Eleanor was unstable, that she had run off. They produced fake letters, false witnesses. They painted me as a scorned lover. With no body and no physical evidence, the case went cold. But I knew Richard was responsible for her disappearance. I believe he killed her that night. The weight of it all was crushing. Her father was a murderer. Her mother was a hero. And the man beside her was a casualty of a war he never should have had to fight. For the past 25 years, Alistair said, his voice ragged, I have been searching. I've hired the best private investigators in the world. I've spent a fortune trying to find a crack in the Sterling family's wall of silence, trying to find justice for Eleanor. And I've been searching for you. He turned to her, his gaze intense. It took years. The orphanage had no records connecting you to Eleanor. But I had my investigators look for girls who entered the system on that exact date in that specific area. We finally found you 5 years ago. I learned where you lived, where you worked. You've been watching me. The question was not an accusation, but a stunned realization. His constant presence at the restaurant, his silent observation. It all made sense now. From a distance, he confirmed. I wanted to protect you. Richard Sterling is still out there. His family is as powerful as ever. I was terrified that if I approached you, if he learned of your existence, he would see you as a threat, as unfinished business. I couldn't bear the thought of him hurting you too. So I just watched to make sure you were okay. My visits to the restaurant, it was the only way I could be close to her by being close to you. His confession was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. His melancholy, his solitude, it was a self-imposed penance, a 25-year vigil for the woman he had lost and the daughter he had sworn to protect. The photograph in his wallet wasn't just a memento. It was a relic, a sacred object, the last remnant of a life that had been stolen from him. His panic when he lost it was the panic of a man losing his last connection to hope. The story settled around them in the quiet darkness of the park, a heavy shroud woven from love sacrifice and unimaginable loss. Amelia felt hollowed out, as if her entire life had been a waiting room, and she had finally been called in to receive the worst possible news. The truth hadn't set her free. It had imprisoned her in a new kind of pain. She was the daughter of a hero and a monster, the living embodiment of their tragic collision. The tears that streamed down her face were no longer just for herself. They were for her mother, Eleanor, whose fierce love had been her only shield. They were for Alistair, the man who had loved her mother so much that he had spent a quarter of a century living in the shadow of her absence, silently guarding her legacy. And they were even for the baby she once was left in the arms of a stranger, saved and orphaned in the very same moment. Alistair watched her, his own grief reflected in her face. He had carried this burden alone for so long, and now in sharing it, he seemed to find a new, albeit somber, resolve. He reached out his hand, hesitating for a moment before he gently placed it on her shoulder. The touch was not familiar or paternal, but it was solid, a grounding anchor in the swirling vortex of her emotions. "I failed her, Amelia," he said, his voice thick with self-recrimination. "I promised I would protect her, and I failed." Amelia looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "You didn't fail her. You loved her. And you found me. You kept her memory alive." In that moment, a profound shift occurred between them. He was no longer just Mr. Covington, the enigmatic billionaire, and she was no longer just the waitress. They were two survivors of the same shipwreck, finally finding each other on a desolate shore. "Eleanor wanted a life for you," Alistair said, his voice gaining strength. "A life full of opportunity, safety, and happiness. A life far away from Richard Sterling and the poison of his world. The life you've had, it's not what she would have wanted. It's not what you deserve." He took a deep breath, his expression transforming from one of grief to one of fierce determination. "I can't be the father you lost, Amelia. That is a truth we both must bear. But I can be the family you never had. I made a promise to your mother that I would look after you. It's a promise I have kept from a distance for too long. Let me keep it properly. Let me give you the life she dreamed of for you. It wasn't a fairy tale offer to sweep her away from her problems. It was something deeper, more meaningful. It was an invitation to share a history, to build a future on the foundations of a tragic past. It was a chance to finally belong somewhere to someone." Through her tears, Amelia nodded. "Okay," she whispered. It was a simple word, but it held the weight of a lifetime of loneliness. It was an acceptance of not just his help, but of the complicated, painful truth of who she was. They sat in silence for a while longer, the city lights across the river seeming a little warmer, a little brighter than before. The story wasn't over, and they both knew it. The question surrounding Eleanor's final fate still hung in the air, a dark and ominous cloud. Alistair reached into his pocket and took out his half of the photograph. Amelia, mirroring his action, took out hers. He carefully laid his piece on the bench between them, and she placed hers beside it, the jagged edges meeting perfectly. The image was whole again. Eleanor and Alistair smiling, bathed in the sunlight of a day long past their love captured forever. "This isn't the end of the story," Alistair said, his voice a low, steely vow. "This is a new beginning. I have spent years gathering information, looking for weaknesses in the Sterling Empire. Now I'm not just fighting for a ghost. I'm fighting for you, for your future. We will find out exactly what happened to your mother, and Richard Sterling will pay for what he did. I promise you that." Amelia looked down at the joined photograph. Her past was no longer a blank page or a ripped image. It was a story of incredible love and devastating sacrifice. Her future, once a narrow path of survival, had just opened up into a wide, unknown territory. It would be a path fraught with danger and painful discoveries, but for the first time in her life, she would not be walking it alone. Together, she and Alistair would seek the final, terrible truth, not just for justice, but for the memory of the woman who connected them, the woman who had given one of them life, and the other a reason to keep living. The truth didn't offer Amelia a fairy tale ending, but something far more precious a beginning. The photograph, once a symbol of her fractured past, was now whole, a testament to a love that transcended even death. Her journey was far from over. The shadow of her father, Richard Sterling, loomed large, and the mystery of her mother's final moments remained unsolved. But she was no longer a lonely waitress, defined by what she lacked. She was the daughter of Eleanor Vance, a hero who made the ultimate sacrifice. Alongside Alistair Covington, the man who never stopped loving her mother, she would step out of the shadows and fight for the justice her mother was denied. Their shared quest for truth has just begun. What do you think will happen next? Will they succeed in bringing a powerful man like Richard Sterling to justice? Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable tales that will leave you in tears and inspire you. Click that notification bell so you never miss what happens next.